In the autumn of 1914, millions of young men marched into a conflict they confidently believed would be over by Christmas. History textbooks traditionally remember the grand strategies of generals, the shifting borders of empires, and the staggering, unfathomable loss of human life. More than 20 million souls lost to the shadows of the Great War. Yet, behind the cold, industrialized statistics of the front lines lies a deeper, silent tragedy. The millions of final words that never made it home. Letters buried beneath collapsed trenches, final thoughts dissolved in the mud of Flanders, and desperate goodbyes swallowed entirely by the chaos of the battlefield. For nearly a century, the vast majority of these personal histories remained lost forever, erased by time and the elements. But out of these forgotten millions, one single artifact defied the laws of probability, the harsh currents of the ocean, and death itself. On September 9th, 1914, just days after the outbreak of the First World War, a 26-year-old British soldier stood on the damp deck of a troop ship crossing the English Channel. Gripped by a sudden, profound, and unshakable melancholy, he did something extraordinary. He took a scrap of paper, penned a final message to his wife, sealed it inside a green glass ginger beer bottle, and cast it into the freezing, dark waters of the Atlantic. Less than 2 weeks later, the young soldier met his definitive end on the Western Front. His story should have concluded there, buried in an unmarked grave in France. However, 85 years later, a completely unrelated event on the River Thames would pull this piece of the past out of the dark water, a message meant for a grieving widow who had long since passed away, but ultimately destined for a little girl who was now an elderly woman living on the other side of the planet. Before we uncover the extraordinary, decades-long journey of this floating promise, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We dedicate hundreds of hours to unearthing the forgotten, deeply human chapters of wartime history, and your support ensures these voices are never silenced again. This is the chronicle of a message that refused to die. The air over the English Channel in September 1914 was biting and thick with mist. Aboard the crowded transport ships, the atmosphere among the men of the British Expeditionary Force was a complex mixture of nervous adrenaline and profound isolation. The grand political propaganda of the era had promised these young men glory, adventure, and a swift, heroic return to their families. But on the open water, far from the cheering crowds of London and the patriotic brass bands, the romantic illusions of war began to rapidly evaporate, replaced by the grim reality of the unknown destination ahead. Among the sea of khaki uniforms on deck stood Private Thomas Hughes. At 26 years old, Thomas was not a career military man seeking conquest. He was a husband to his beloved wife, Elizabeth, and a father to a vulnerable 2-year-old baby girl named Emily. As the vessel cut through the choppy gray waves towards the French coast, Thomas found himself isolated from the boisterous conversations of his fellow soldiers. He was consumed by a quiet, devastating certainty, a psychological premonition that he would never see the white cliffs of Dover again. The steady, mechanical thrum of the ship's engine felt like a rhythmic countdown to his own fate. Driven by an urgent need to anchor his love to the world he was leaving behind, Thomas sought out a quiet corner of the deck. With a steady hand, he pulled a small piece of paper from his kit. He didn't write of grand strategies or military pride. Instead, his words were a simple, heartbreaking request born of desperation. He wrote a brief letter to Elizabeth, carefully folded it, and included a note addressed to whoever might find it, pleading for the stranger to forward the message to his home address in West London. To protect his words from the harsh marine environment, Thomas placed the note inside a sturdy green glass ginger beer bottle, sealing the cork as tightly as his hands allowed. Standing at the ship's railing, looking out into the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean, he threw the bottle into the wake of the ship. He watched the small green object bob helplessly against the massive waves until the gray fog hid it from view. It was a fragile vessel, carrying his last connection to the living world. Thomas had no way of knowing that, while he was marching toward a violent historical cataclysm, his fragile glass bottle was entering a realm of absolute silence, embarking on a journey that would outlive the very empire he was wearing the uniform to defend. As Thomas stepped off the transport ship onto French soil, the bottle began its quiet drift through the deep. But as the young soldier marched toward the front lines, a violent storm was gathering in a valley called Ain, a storm that would demand the ultimate sacrifice from Private Hughes much sooner than he could have ever anticipated. By mid-September 1914, the initial romantic illusions of the war had completely shattered against the reality of industrial slaughter. Private Thomas Hughes, alongside the men of the British Expeditionary Force, stepped off the transports and were immediately swept into the chaotic retreat from Mons, eventually digging in along the steep, wooded banks of the Ain River. This was not the heroic mobile warfare promised by recruiters in London. This was the dawn of a new, terrifying reality, the birth of trench warfare. The Battaglia du Ain became a meat grinder of unprecedented proportions. Over the course of several weeks, hundreds of thousands of men clashed in a claustrophobic landscape, dominated by constant artillery bombardment, torrential rain, and thick, damp fog. The macro history of the battle records it as a tactical stalemate, a line drawn in the mud that would solidify into the Western Front for the next 4 years. But for Thomas, the macro history dissolved into a relentless barrage of sensory horrors. The constant, deafening roar of high explosive shells, the smell of cordite mixed with decaying earth, and the freezing mud that caked his uniform. On the morning of September 24th, 1914, less than 2 weeks after casting his message into the sea, the brutal reality of the front lines claimed its price. During a fierce counterattack through the dense fog, Private Thomas Hughes met his definitive end. He was just 26 years old. In the chaotic aftermath of the battle, his physical remains were buried in a modest, hurried grave under the French soil, his name added to the tragic, ever-growing lists of the missing and the fallen. Back in West London, the telegraph arrived at the doorstep of Elizabeth Hughes. In an instant, her world collapsed. She was now a grieving widow, and 2-year-old Emily was left fatherless, with nothing but a few fading photographs and the agonizing silence of a life cut short. The story of Thomas Hughes appeared to be completely concluded, buried deep beneath the scarred landscape of France, forgotten by a world that was rapidly moving toward even greater catastrophes. While the memory of Thomas Hughes was slowly covered by the dust of history, his fragile green glass bottle remained remarkably alive, navigating a parallel reality of absolute stillness. For 85 years, as the world above tore itself apart and rebuilt itself, the message drifted through the cold, shifting currents of the ocean. Consider the sheer scale of history that transpired while that small piece of paper remained perfectly dry inside its glass sanctuary. The First World War concluded in 1918, leaving empires in ruins. The Roaring Twenties gave way to the crushing poverty of the Great Depression. A second, even more devastating global conflict erupted, followed by the tense decades of the Cold War, the dawn of the space age, and the rise of the digital era. Generations were born and passed away. Maps were redrawn, and the geopolitical landscape shifted beyond recognition. Yet, untouched by the chaos of humanity, the bottle floated on, a silent witness to a changing world. The deepest tragedy of this oceanic exile, however, belonged to Elizabeth. For decades, she lived with the heavy, lingering sorrow of the war. She raised Emily in a world scarred by her father's absence, never knowing that a final, desperate testament of Thomas's love was out there, moving through the deep. Elizabeth grew old, her memories fading, until she finally passed away, reunited with her husband in death, but never receiving the closure he had so desperately tried to send her. By the late 1990s, the bottle had been at sea for nearly a century. The cork had held against the immense pressure of the tides, and the green glass had resisted the abrasive friction of sand and rock. It was a mathematical impossibility, a fragile anomaly surviving in a hostile environment. But as the millennium approached, the unpredictable currents finally began to push the bottle away from the open sea, drawing it back toward the heart of England, directly into the path of an ordinary man who was about to break 85 years of absolute silence. In 1999, the world was standing on the precipice of a new millennium. Society was consumed by the rapid expansion of the digital age, looking entirely toward the future. The memory of the First World War had transitioned from living recollection into the cold pages of history textbooks. The generation that had marched into the mud of 1914 was nearly gone, but in the murky tidal waters of the River Thames, the past was about to violently break through the surface of the present. It was an ordinary, overcast day when Steve Gowan, a seasoned fisherman, was navigating his boat through the gray waters near Southend, Essex. As he hauled in his heavy fishing nets, expecting the usual catch or the mundane debris of the modern world, he noticed an unfamiliar weight. Tangled within the mesh, covered in a thick layer of river silt and decades of marine growth, was a thick, green glass ginger beer bottle. Most people would have discarded it as mere garbage, but Gowan noticed something extraordinary through the dark, encrusted glass. The interior was completely dry, and nestled inside was a tightly folded piece of paper. With meticulous care, he managed to extract the cork that had held its seal against the immense pressure of the tides for 85 years. As he unfolded the fragile parchment, the faint scent of the early 20th century seemed to escape into the modern air. Written in faded but entirely legible ink was the desperate plea of Private Thomas Hughes from September 9th, 1914. The letter read, "Dear Finder, please forward this note to Mrs. Hughes at 33 Green Street, West Ham, London. From her aggressive husband, Tom." Accompanying it was a deeply moving note intended solely for his wife, written on the eve of his departure to the front lines. Gowan realized he wasn't just holding an antique, he was holding the final, undelivered breath of a man who had been lost to the shadows of the Great War. Driven by a profound sense of duty, the fisherman transformed into a historian, launching a dedicated investigation to fulfill a dead soldier's dying wish. He contacted historical societies and military archives, tracing the ghost of Thomas Hughes. The search quickly revealed the tragic truth. Elizabeth Hughes, had long since passed away, leaving the designated address decades ago. The line of the family seemed entirely lost. But just as the trail threatened to go cold, a stunning archival discovery changed everything. The 2-year-old baby girl Thomas had left behind, Emily, was still alive. She was now 86 years old, living thousands of miles away in the serene landscapes of Auckland, New Zealand. The distance between the muddy banks of the River Thames and the quiet suburbs of Auckland spans half the globe, crossing vast oceans and entirely different worlds. Yet the invisible thread tied to that green glass bottle proved unbreakable. Recognizing the monumental weight of the artifact he had uncovered, Steve Gowan knew that merely mailing the letter would be an injustice to the memory of Private Hughes. He arranged to travel across the planet to deliver the message in person. In a quiet living room in New Zealand, the past and the present finally collided in a scene of immense emotional tragedy and profound beauty. Emily Crowhurst, an elderly woman at the twilight of her life, sat opposite the fisherman. She had spent 86 years living with a structural void in her heart, possessing no personal memories of the young father who had vanished into the fog of the Western Front when she was just a toddler. To her, Thomas Hughes was a myth, a handsome face frozen in a single, faded black and white military photograph. With trembling hands, Emily took the piece of paper. The physical contrast in the room was overwhelming. A woman in her late 80s, holding a document written by her own father when he was a vibrant, hopeful 26-year-old youth. As her eyes scanned the elegant, hurried script, the decades of separation dissolved. For the very first time in her life, she was listening directly to his voice. The letter did not speak of grand victories or political allegiance. It spoke of absolute devotion to his family, a quiet reassurance sent from the deck of a transport ship by a man who knew, deep in his soul, that his time on this earth was limited. The ink, preserved perfectly by the green glass, served as a physical manifestation of a father's protective embrace, reaching across 85 years of silence, bypassing death itself to finally reach the child he had left behind. The extraordinary odyssey of Private Thomas Hughes and his message in a bottle stands as one of the most mathematically improbable and deeply human anomalies in the history of modern warfare. Shortly after the emotional reunion, the historic green glass bottle and the original letter were generously donated to the Auckland War Memorial Museum, ensuring that this testament to human connection would be preserved for generations to come. Emily passed away a few years later, finally carrying the complete closure her father had cast into the ocean so long ago. When we examine the macro history of the First World War, we are constantly confronted with staggering, numbing statistics. Millions of casualties, countless missing men, and entire generations erased by the machinery of industrial conflict. It is incredibly easy for the individual human soul to become entirely lost within those astronomical numbers. But the story of Thomas Hughes reminds us that every single statistic was a living, breathing individual with an intricate universe of hopes, fears, and profound loves. The Great War succeeded in claiming Thomas's physical life in the mud of Ain, silencing him before he could ever watch his daughter grow. Yet, the brutal reality of the front lines could not destroy the message he left behind. The fragile glass bottle defied the violent currents of the Atlantic, survived the crushing weight of the deep, and outlasted the rise and fall of global empires, all to fulfill a simple promise of love. It proves that while governments wage wars and histories are written by the victors, the raw, unyielding power of the human heart refuses to be buried. The voices of the fallen are never truly gone. Sometimes they are merely waiting in the dark, waiting for the tide to finally bring them home.